Hi, I'm Conor Byrne, and you are listening and watching That's What I Call Marketing, the podcast where you will hear from the leading lights in the marketing world and listen to their unique stories. Today, I am talking to Dr. Draper, author, associate creative director, and head of copy, Ryan Wallman. Ryan works at Wellmark, a Melbourne-based creative agency that specializes in healthcare, everything from pharmaceutical marketing through to consumer health campaigns. Ryan has written for numerous industry publications, including Marketing Week, and is a contributor of the best-selling marketing book, Eat Your Greens. In 2019, Ryan released Delusions of Brandeur, a pretty funny, sometimes close to the bone satirical view of Adland. But it's based in some really deep knowledge, so he kind of gets away with it. Dave Trott said he loves the book, and Rory Sutherland said not only is this a marvellous book, but no one other than Dr. Wallman could have written it. Today we talk about healthcare marketing, commercial purpose being okay, making better decisions, the need to get a grounding in marketing, showing clients the work and getting there early, avoiding the temptation to do something new fast, and how you can start a sentence with "and," which I just did. Enjoy this episode. Ryan, thanks a million for joining me on That's What I Call Marketing. Great to see you.
Great to see you too, Conor. Thank you for having me.
Obviously, your evening time there, my morning time here. You're heading into winter. I'm heading into summer, but I think we're both experiencing the same temperature. Like it's 12 degrees in Dublin.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
You have the heating on and I have the shorts on. Thankfully, nobody needs to see that. Listen, so we want to get straight into it, and I feel like you've probably told this first bit maybe 1,000 times. You're well known on Twitter as Dr._Draper. Can you, for anyone who doesn't know the story behind maybe why you're called that, and I think that'd be interesting for people to hear.
Sure. Yeah, I have kind of explained this a few times, but I always feel a bit embarrassed about it as well. So basically, when I joined Twitter, which I think must have been at least 10 years ago now. At that stage, I was, so the background to the doctor part is that I am actually trained as a doctor. I practiced in medicine for about 7 years, but before I kind of moved into the marketing communications industry, so I started out as a medical writer initially. And so, yeah, when I joined Twitter, I was sort of, having to think about a handle, and I think at that stage I was quite into Mad Men.
Yeah.
And so I fancied myself as a bit of a medical version of Dr. Draper, which is highly embarrassing now. But, it's sort of, I've had to stick with it. So yeah, that's how it came about.
But it's a very interesting path to go from medicine into advertising. Mm-hmm. Was there a moment where you were like, I've had enough? I think I did either read or hear you kind of saying, actually just the world of medicine was challenging, like a really tough world. But what made you make that transition?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it is. And I worked in psychiatry for most of the time that I was in clinical medicine. So particularly public psychiatry is a tough gig. It's a pretty grueling area of medicine. You work with a lot of very unwell people. It can be quite stressful in terms of dealing with aggressive people and, acutely psychotic people and so on. And so I did get to a point where I felt like I couldn't imagine myself doing it for the rest of my life, kind of thing. And so I sort of figured that I had to, make a decision about whether I wanted to stay. And at the same time, I was very drawn to writing,
right.
And not sort of marketing writing per se, but I sort of knew that I wanted to write in some capacity. So that's when I started looking for a job as a writer, and it kind of made sense that I went into medical writing because I'd done so much study, and I didn't want to throw that away. So yeah, so that's how it happened.
And was there because like you could have gone, I guess, a couple of ways with writing. It could have been, right, I'm going to become a novelist or a journalist, or how did the Adland piece happen?
Yeah, well, kind of serendipitously, really,
right?
Because as you alluded to there are lots of different forms of writing, and even within medical writing, that's true. Healthcare journalism, for example, is very different from pharmaceutical marketing, which is what I'm doing and what I've ended up in, really. And it was really because I literally went to Seek at that stage and sort of plugged in medical writer and came across this job as a medical writer at the agency that I'm still working at, and that was 15 years ago. So, I sort of fell into it, I suppose, as much as you can fall into a job like that. But I think it's been quite lucky because it really is probably the area that I should have ended up. This is the sort of work that I enjoy. I really like the advertising industry as much as I'm not sort of in mainstream advertising, obviously, but yeah, I think it sort of suits my background and my skills. So yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, I guess in a way you could never have seen probably that path. You know what I mean? Going to become studying medicine and studying medicine to become a copywriter.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's a very circuitous way to get there. But interestingly enough, and I've mentioned this on a couple of podcasts as well, is one of my colleagues is also a former doctor. Who took a very similar path and went into medical writing, and now has kind of diverged into strategy rather than the creative side of it. But yeah, we've got a couple of doctors, which is obviously very unusual.
Very different type of agency. But look, it's interesting as I meet a lot of people for this podcast, there definitely are, varying different paths for people coming into marketing. And I think that's great. Like there's the people who, remember when they were 7 and they saw an ad and I always wanted to do that. But then there's people, and I'd be a bit like you, like I worked in hospitality and nonprofits and kind of came into marketing via that. And I think it's good. I think it's good that there's kind of, those options are open to people, and it makes it a more interesting industry. I think you mentioned the agency you've been in for the past 15 years, Wellmark, make sure I get the name right, and they specialize in healthcare marketing. Can you tell me a bit about the work that you and the agency do?
Yeah, so it really started out as essentially a pharmaceutical marketing agency. So when I joined the agency, the bulk of our clients were pharmaceutical companies. That has changed over time. So it's actually a minority of the work that we do now. We still do pharmaceutical work, but we've really diversified into sort of broader healthcare. So, we work for anything from hospitals to, internal communications for hospitals, promotional campaigns, that kind of thing. Through to quite technical medical writing. We've written or drafted journal articles and that kind of thing. We work for medical device companies. But yeah, and we still sort of do retain that sort of traditional pharmaceutical marketing as well. So yeah, it's quite diverse within healthcare, but yeah, it's all healthcare.
And I don't know the space well enough, but I'm not aware of a lot of agencies that are kind of that specialized in that area. But then I also know when you're talking to people who are looking for people for healthcare marketing roles, that requirement to understand the healthcare space is very strong. Recruiters are like, well, no, you have to have worked in healthcare. Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that. Yes, I think it is a massive advantage to have some kind of healthcare background, and that's obviously how I got into it. And I have found that people who are from the sort of the consumer side can struggle with healthcare communications because it is it's so highly regulated, and you have to you really have to have some kind of knowledge of those regulations and what you can say and what you can't and so on. But having said that, there's been a real shift in healthcare advertising in the last few years, maybe a little bit more, where it's sort of become a trendy area to be in. And there are a lot of big healthcare agencies, particularly in the States and Europe, that have taken on people from the consumer side. And I think it's probably been for the betterment of the industry generally. It's really just diversified the sort of thinking and creative talent that is in the industry, and it's really lifted the level of creativity that you see in healthcare advertising, particularly pharma, which tends to be very, very cliched and sort of a bit lazy, for want of a better word. So yeah, it's been an interesting change. So I think, but when you have people from a healthcare background working with people who don't have that background, I think that's when the magic happens. So
yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I often think of healthcare advertising. Some of the ads I might see in the States where, there's a medical product and then there's like 27 minutes of, if you take this product, you may die.
I think South Park's done a parody of that, hasn't it? But yeah, that's kind of the classic. And the interesting thing is that the regulations vary from country to country. And the thing about the States is that you can advertise pharmaceutical products to the public, which we can't do, you guys can't do. And so it's very different. And that's why you get all these, ridiculous disclaimers at the end. But yeah, it's got a real feel about it, that American pharma advertising.
Yeah, I do enjoy it. The one thing I do when I go to any country is put on the TV so I can see the ads, and they're some of my favorites. So interesting, maybe going back to that point about kind of the merging, or the coming together of maybe the consumer and the healthcare. And I know from reading, some of the stuff you've written, you have, clearly really strong, understanding and grounding in the principles of marketing, of brand building. And how do you find you're able to apply that in the agency and in the role you're in?
Yeah, well, thanks. I don't know if that's entirely true, but I guess one of the things for me is that, as well as the healthcare background, I've done a Master of Marketing and kind of, was schooled by Mark Ritson and others at that, business school. So yes, I've had a pretty broad education in marketing beyond just my day-to-day work. And what I would say is that when you have that grounding and sort of, I guess the more recent evidence base that is built up in marketing with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and Byron Sharp's work and so on. And I have kind of made this point before as well, is that it really helps to be able to use that evidence when you're working with clients in healthcare, because they tend to be very evidence-driven people. A lot of the time you're dealing with people who have got medical backgrounds, for example, or on the legal side or whatever. And if you can back up what your creative work with evidence, then it tends to sort of it just makes your case a lot stronger.
That's a really interesting point, because I often think about some of the challenges marketers face are often with people in finance maybe, and that's again quite rational, and so I get, but that makes a lot of sense. If you're working with people in healthcare, they're going to be like, well, what's the evidence, because everything's based on science. So I have found that very helpful. It just sort of gives you a bit more credibility, I think, and because otherwise you sort of feel as though creatives are coming at it from a completely different perspective from from the people on the medical side, or they are, here's the art, like what. One of the things again I read about you talked about the work that you do, and you said it's great because it is often actually ultimately life-saving work. And I don't think you were trying to overstate the work that you do, but you're getting to work on products and things that actually ultimately can save lives. How then do you feel about I think generally kind of the purpose, right? Because I think, clearly if you're working with, a brand that has a product that can potentially save a life, like that has a real, to me, purpose. How do you then feel to kind of like I always think about the Hellmann's mayonnaise example. I think one of the investors said, if we need to say Hellmann's has a purpose, that there's a problem, like it's for sandwiches. What's your view on kind of where we're at and all that? Because I think truly you're working in an industry that can say, yes, we have a purpose.
Yeah, and look, I think in some ways that makes it easier for me or for people who work in healthcare communications, because there is an inherent purpose there, and we don't have to build one in. We don't have to kind of contrive it.
Yeah.
And as you may know from some of the stuff that I've written, I'm very skeptical about brand purpose more broadly, and this kind of tacking on brand purpose to things which just don't deserve to have it. But because I think ultimately I agree with people like Steve Harrison, who has written a lot about this. the purpose of marketing in generally, away from, aside from healthcare, is to create a demand for products that then drive, economic growth and so on, and ultimately it's about people making a livelihood out of it. There doesn't need to be a purpose that is loftier than that, and I think the advertising industry has kind of lost sight of that in many ways. But yeah, so I guess I'm kind of lucky in that we don't have to contrive that sort of thing generally. Yeah.
And it's, I guess some brands are by how they were founded often, it's founded on kind of a need that can tie to a purpose. But it's just, I think the kind of there seems to be a leveling out of it. I think, I think the challenging economic environments a lot of us are operating in, I think is kind of leveling it out, and people are kind of getting to the more, look, this is commercial, right?
Yeah.
If there's good comes out of it, that's great.
Exactly right. And I think, as Byron Sharp said, there's no shame in that. And I think for some reason there seems to be almost a self-loathing among some people in marketing about what they do, and they need to sort of find something greater when, that's really not the case. There is a sort of maybe nobility is probably putting it a bit too strongly, but there's nothing wrong with that purpose, with a commercial purpose.
Yeah.
Assuming that it's ethical and all those other things, and it's responsible. But
and everyone's going to have their own like moral compass. I remember working in an agency before, and a wide variety of brands, from soft drinks, there was banks, and this was around the time of the banks were very, very bold in this country, in Ireland, and then we won an account for a poker brand, and our planner was just like, no, I like, she left the agency, and I was like, look, okay, everyone has their moment. Everyone's like, I can't do it. I can't do poker, and there's personal reasons. I was like, like they're paying well.
Well, I agree, and there is, the line is different for everyone, I think. It's just it really is that imposition of a sort of something that's loftier that sort of gets to me, and of course that's all the stuff that gets entered into awards, and so it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
When the commercial side. Actually, I just recently judged a category of an awards here, and it was actually brilliant. It was kind of refreshing actually to see how tied to commercial outcomes the entries were, and I was like, this is great, because even ones that could be seen as more, we're doing a good thing, was like, but the commercial outcomes were these. I was like, this is good, right? I want to see more of that.
It's weird that's refreshing, but here we are.
So look, I love your book, Delusions of Brandeur. Fantastic. And what made you write the book? What was that again? That moment you're like, I have a book in me.
Well, again, I kind of fell into it, if you like. I didn't sort of set out to write a book. What happened really was that I had for years been doing little satirical pieces on Twitter. And writing blog posts and that kind of thing. And after a while, I just thought, look, I had seen a few people put out books that were in a similar-ish vein, like Bob Hoffman, for example. I think he even mentioned on Twitter, he's like, this is literally just a collection of my blog posts. If you're expecting anything else, then you're going to be disappointed. I was like, oh, okay. Maybe I can make something out of what I've already done without having to put in too much effort. And so I pretty much just did that. I got together all the stuff that anything that had been vaguely popular on Twitter, as well as the more popular blog posts and so on. And I sent it all, as Word documents, it was very, very unsophisticated, to Giles Edwards, who was my collaborator. And he put it together and made it look great. And that was it.
It does. I mean, it does look great, and it's a great and enjoyable read. And there's bits in it that I was reading back over before this, and I'm like, okay, I have to ask about some of these things. And some of these things are just like, they're wonderful. They're also probably quite confronting in parts for people in the industry. So so one of the ones I wanted to ask you about, I have here is, I'm not going to ask you to remember all these things, but the top 10 reasons that marketers give for making their decisions, right? Like I love this. It's what I would want if I was the customer. My mate Dave thinks it's great. And then there's one in here, which was number 7 in the top 10, is Gary Vaynerchuk shouted it at me. And I was like, what's going on there?
I can't remember exactly, but I must have just recently seen one of those videos. That, remember, he used to have those videos where he just kind
put his feet up on the table and
and just shouts at the camera. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. And people seem to take it in and seem to think he was great. And I don't know. I actually got into a little exchange with him on Twitter once. And
did you?
I think I had said something a bit rude, and someone tagged him, and he responded very, very kindly, to be fair. And I think we ended up agreeing to have a wine somewhere at some stage. But yeah, didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, fair play to him in some ways, but when you look at that, and I think there's some great things in it, and it's because Apple. But from your perspective, then, like, what are the things that marketers can do to help them make better decisions?
Yeah, well, look, I always say this, but being trained in marketing, and this is, I'm kind of parroting what Mark Ritson often says, but it's really true. It's quite amazing how many people in our industry not only don't have any formal education in marketing, but also see it as almost a virtue. And I just can't, it's hard to think of another industry where people see ignorance or not being educated as being a positive, and it genuinely is like that by some people. Oh well, if you want to be up with the latest trends, then you can't be adhering to traditional marketing practice and so on. And so I really think that anyone who, if you young marketers or people coming into the industry or whatever, I think the first thing that you should do is get a general grounding in marketing fundamentals, and probably Mark's mini MBA is about, it's the easiest and quickest way that you can do that. That's what I think.
Or one of the ones for me would be Paul Feldwick's books, actually. Because I mean, I think to that point, I think the history of advertising and why we believe or say some of the things we say, not even believe some of the things we believe. I think it's say some of the things we say. Yeah. And when you look at Paul's 2 books, I think they're a fantastic way of kind of entering into, okay, that's why that is, a thing. And so even if the mini MBA from Mr. Ritson is out of reach, there's 2 books out there and there's more books. But like, I think, that curiosity is important.
Exactly. And that's probably a very good point to make, actually, because, not everyone will have necessarily the resources to be able to undertake formal education, but some of it, you can literally just get Drayton Bird's Common Sense Marketing book, as you say, Paul Feldwick's books, and you're already better off than 50% of marketers out there if you've got that grounding. So, I agree.
Yeah, Drayton Bird's book,
essential.
Yeah, Drayton Bird's books are phenomenal as well. I love that stuff. I'm going to go on to one of the other pieces here. Sorry, it's not like a book reading, but I love these points that you've made, and it's in the Cheats Guide. Heed words of the wise. I think that's kind of what we've just talked about, like looking to those that have experienced, like people like Dave Trott, Bob Hoffman, and then another one that struck me, and it's come up with a few other people, is avoid overcomplication. You must see this in the agency a lot, where people are coming in. Is it the overcomplication of the brief? Is it the overcomplication of the output?
Yeah. Look, I guess what I was probably referring to there, if I had to think of a specific example, is the fact that, when agencies present 200 slides on a deck, to use the industry term, before they even get to the creative idea. You know, I think maybe we might be slightly overcomplicating things. I think it's probably been born out of the fact we sort of feel as though we have to justify what we're doing with all that rational type of messaging.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's not what is going to make an impact. So yeah, look, I think particularly the way that strategy has kind of superseded everything else in some ways. Not that I've got anything against strategy or strategists, but I do think, you know, that was almost that's a relatively new phenomenon in advertising. If we're talking, you know, if you think back to the sort of the heydays of the 60s and so on.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know that it's really improved things much. So I don't know. I'm probably going to make enemies there. Sorry.
No, I don't, because I don't think so. In the sense that, you know, I've been looking to speak with James Herman from Previously Unavailable and Andy Nairn from Lucky Generals, and both of them actually had very similar, and they're both kind of strategists and planners, and they both have the same view, kind of saying the skill is to simplify it and distill it down into something really short and succinct. And I think we've all sat in meetings where, you know, the planner is, you know, and everyone's losing the will to live because it's just like, it's slide 97. You're like, oh no, like, you know. And another one, like, you know, Johnny Cahill, who's now CMO of Heineken in the USA, he said in his role, I think sometimes the further up you get, the further away from the work you get. And he said in his role, seeing the creative is probably one of the most exciting things he'll do that quarter, if not that 6 months. He goes, like, get to it. Like, get to it.
Well, there's a fantastic video by Nick Ellis. I don't know if you know Nick. He's one of the founders of Halo, which is a Bristol agency. He did this fantastic isolated talk, which is the talk series that Giles Edwards set up during COVID. And it's called Wow, How Now, and he makes the point that, you know, clients want to see the creative, they want to see the exciting stuff, and so put it up front, do it first, and then explain, you know, the rationale behind it and so on. And it made a lot of sense. So a bit of an
and again, back to Paul Feldwick's, like, the showmanship, because even in that moment, it, like, you know, be Barnum, right? Like, have the showmanship. You also talk, and again, really love this, you know, board of your brand. And I think a lot of us talk about, oh, you know, the decay of the ad, and, you know, people have seen it too often, and we should rotate, and we should, you know, all that kind of stuff. But your point is, people don't think about your brand as often as you do, and, you know, resist kind of the temptation to create something new for the sake of something new. Again, probably something you've seen, but what advice would you have for, you know, maybe somebody, I think often entering into a new role, and that temptation is often very strong because there's maybe a place where they feel they can make the most impact. You know, what advice would you have for anybody?
You mean on the client side?
I think, and I think from the agency perspective, because if you're working on a client's and work, and then you see, okay, here comes new head of marketing, CMO, you know, how would you kind of try help them navigate the resistance to go and let's do something new?
That's a very tricky one, and I'm not very good at kind of politics. I leave that to our account manager and so on. But look, I think as certainly for marketers that are coming into new roles, I think there's a lot to be said for not doing anything much for a while and getting the lay of the land and sort of, you know, understanding the research, understanding what the campaign's done so far. I think, as you say, there's so much temptation to do something. And it's funny, there are actually some parallels in medicine, you know, that you sort of feel compelled sometimes to institute a management decision when sometimes the best thing to do is to simply wait and observe.
Yeah. And
I think that's definitely true in marketing. And there is this issue of marketers assuming that campaigns will wear out a lot quicker than what they do, and you know, the way that consumers respond to them. And it's a real problem. And of course, then the other issue is that agencies are looking to, you know, to do a new campaign because they want to be paid for it or whatever. So it's tricky. It's really tricky, but yeah, I don't know that I've got great advice on that.
Yeah, but and I think you're. It's probably that balance is interesting because the agency may see, right, here comes somebody new. We can do something new. Maybe the braver thing for everybody in that situation to do is, what can we keep? You know, what needs to be freshened up. And you know, I think the brand gym often talk about the fresh consistency, and there's great examples of brands that just continue to be consistent, but in a fresh way. And I guess
sorry, I was just going to say, a great piece about that in How Brands Grow, where he talks about, you know, refreshing it but keeping the brand messaging consistent as one of his kind of principles of effective advertising. So yeah, I think that's very true. And you're right. I think, you know, if you're going to have long-term relationships with clients, then maybe being a bit braver about being strong on those, you know, about saying, look, this campaign has longer to go, I guess, you know, engenders trust in the relationship, and that you're actually interested in making sure that the work is effective over the long term. So
exactly. And I think there's always the, you know, the worry that the account's going to go, and maybe sometimes that's the right thing. You also talk about kind of the need for people to loosen the grip on the creative process. I think that might have been related to maybe creative awards, but anyway, I find that really interesting, and I'd love you to talk about that and kind of your experience of, you know, the grip being too tight and where you've seen it being more successful when people loosen that grip.
Yeah, well, speaking from personal experience, you know, it just makes so much difference if you are given creative freedom without subjective feedback, and especially subjective feedback early on. So I think the big mistake that a lot of clients make is that, you know, they assume that they are the target audience, and that's, as you know, things can go off track very quickly if they decide that they don't like whatever it is, you know, a particular color or, you know, whatever it is. And the really great clients that I've worked with have been able to take that step back and evaluate creative on some kind of objective merit. And that's when I think you kind of permitted some creative freedom to be able to do whatever you think is best. But yeah, I think micromanaging feedback, for want of a better phrase, is just not helpful to anyone, and particularly not sort of as you're going through the phases of creative development. You know, I mean, we've all seen creative get watered down to the point that it becomes basically unrecognisable from the, you know, from what you've initially presented or your initial vision. And certainly the best clients that I've worked with and the ones who are able to give you that creative freedom, it always leads to the best outcome.
Right. And do you, in that scenario or in those scenarios, like, are you okay with sharing early, more for a kind of, I don't know how you use the word alignment, but more that you don't get to that point where it starts to get watered down? Or do you prefer kind of scenario where it's like, look, we'll come back to you with something fully baked? What's your approach?
It's a tricky one. I think we've kind of ended up in the situation where we tend to go back with something that's fairly close to what we envision the final product to be. And the risk, I suppose, with that is that clients will judge it as being the final product when it's not. So the closer it is to a finished product, the kind of riskier it is. In fact, in a few recent cases, so particularly we did a pitch a few weeks ago where we deliberately didn't make it look as though it was a finished product. You know, we essentially had scamps and sketch storyboards for that very reason, that we didn't want to make it look as though this is what you're going to get. You know, this has to be refined and so on. And I think it was actually, you know, probably a good idea, because they really kind of got the idea, and the idea was forefront rather than actually seeing what they thought they were going to see as an ad being put out there.
Yeah, and it probably is as well sometimes the client, and their ability, because sometimes I think you can show things, and like as you say, the closer it looks to a finished product, if a client hasn't maybe had the experience of knowing what to look for, how do you guide? That sounds like, sorry, I don't mean that to sound as patronizing as it was about to come out, but I do think in those moments where you're working with clients and you're saying, look, what I need you to look at is this versus, do you like the animatic, or how do you kind of work in that process?
Well, we're generally pretty explicit about that,
right?
But the problem, of course, is that sometimes concepts or whatever you've presented will get passed on to other people, and I think that's the risk, is that you don't know that the way that you've couched it is necessarily going to be passed on to other people, and so if there are other decision makers, then that's the risk. So yeah, you do need to be careful. I don't know that I've got good.
Is there a way to guard against that? Because look, I've seen that. I've been on both sides of that in an agency where it goes away and like weeks later comes back and it's changed 1,000 times, or but then I've also seen it on the client side where yes, there are 10 other people that need to see this, and I guess if looking at that side from the agency into the client, is there a preference that you would like would you like to kind of say to the client, look, bring me with you, let me speak to the CMO with you, or have you seen that work?
Yeah, and I think that can work really well. If you get that opportunity, then I think even if you have to represent, which is obviously painful, but often that can really help, because you don't know how it's going to be framed.
Yeah.
And I think particularly, almost harking back to what we were talking about earlier, with when we're able to present that evidence and put forward our case, I think it just makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, and again, people with differing views and seeing things very late in a process, that can throw everything out the window. And does the longevity of the client relationship help there? Like in your agency, are the relationships you have, are they long-term relationships?
Yeah, most of them are, and it's kind of been a bit of a hallmark of our agency, really. We've had clients for, at the moment, I think our longest standing client is about 7 years, but in the past, we've had clients for over a decade.
Yeah.
So that obviously makes a huge difference. Once you can develop that trust, it becomes a much easier process. So that's really, that is really sort of a philosophy of ours, is that we really like to establish long-term client relationships, as all agencies do. But I think particularly in an area that's as specialised as healthcare.
Yeah.
Getting pharmaceutical brands, for example, we will have a writer dedicated to that brand, for years.
Right.
And so you get to know the brand really intimately. You get to know all the the claims that you can make, the claims you can't make, the references, all the sort of stuff that just becomes almost second nature, that could would take a new person months to get their head around, because it really it can be really technical. So that's really one of the advantages of working in that long-term way. Yeah.
And I think that trust point is so important, that people trust everyone's in it for the right reasons, and just the longer you work, it's not transactional. And like, do you, as the agency, do you turn away project type work, or are you kind of saying, look, we're only going to go for the type of work that's going to be longer term, or do you work on projects in the hope that they'll lead to that long-term relationship?
Depends on the economic situation. Look, ideally, obviously we like to work not sort of with ad hoc projects.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we do that as well.
That comes in.
But we have had situations where we've had a sort of a project that then sort of leads on to another project and then another, and before you know it, you sort of almost an agency of record situation without even meaning to. Which is good. I think if you, as you say, you develop that trust early on, and it sort of engenders a working relationship that's ongoing. So, yeah.
It is it's the ideal scenario, and I think it's but maybe going back to that point as well about the change in leadership can impact that. I was talking to somebody in the States, and he was telling me that it's almost as bad now for agencies that it's not how good the last campaign was, it's how good the last meeting was. If you have a bad meeting, you're like, right, they're gone. You're right, and that's it feels like a race to the bottom.
Yeah, that's a bit depressing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, we've all experienced doing what we think is really great work, and the client's happy, and then for whatever reason, sort of the relationship ends. Because, as you say, maybe someone new comes in, or it almost feels immaterial how good the work was, which is disappointing. But that's
the business.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine who is a copywriter, and he follows you as well. And I asked him which of the things you should never say to a copywriter out of your list was the one he was just like, this is my one. So his was, we've shown it to everyone in the company for their thoughts. Bill from accounts didn't like the tone, and Tommy, the office beagle, pissed on it. I'm guessing that wasn't a real life situation, but for you, out of maybe those or any new ones you're thinking of, like, what are the worst things that people can say to you as a copywriter?
I might have actually been in that list, but yeah, you can't start a sentence with "and" is pretty common.
It's there, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it probably was. No, I can't think of any new ones off the top of my head, but yeah, it's funny. I've become less precious about that sort of stuff. I think it starts to wash over you after a while because you've heard it all before. I think when people who aren't writers start giving you advice about writing it, that can grate a little bit.
Yeah. Nobody reads long.
I think everyone thinks they can write because they can.
100%, yeah, 100%, and it's and I think that's definitely a challenge with marketing advertising. Is it's when you can see it, you can have a view on it. When you can read it, you can have a view on it. And trying to get that balance right of taking input, because people's views are they're coming from a place, so it's valid and it's kind of taking the views. But I think often it's asking, like, what's the right question to ask people when you're looking for feedback? Do you have any advice on people, maybe, copywriters or account managers, when they're going to clients and, looking for feedback? Do you think there's some good questions people can ask that kind of help frame and get good feedback?
Yeah, well, I guess it's probably looking at it from a more of an aerial perspective. I don't know if that's the right term.
Yeah.
But rather than change this word or we don't like that color or whatever, I think the question is, why do you think this isn't going to meet the objectives of your that you've set for this campaign? Why would your audience not respond to this particular concept or image or word or whatever it is? And then you put it back on the agency to make revisions on that basis, rather than this kind of micromanaging. We don't like it starting with "and." That's probably the best way to go about it, I think.
Yeah, taking it up and out from the actual work, which again, go back to your previous point, is why sometimes presenting in a way that people are looking at the idea, not the script.
The specifics, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You have a new book coming out, which I discovered on Twitter. So tell me a bit about the book. What's left to say?
Okay. So the story about this book has become a bit of an epic saga. It's like Guns N' Roses' latest album. It's been years in the making now. We've been talking about it, and I don't know if it's ever going to happen. Look, if Giles is listening, I'm going to pull your finger out, mate. So basically, look, it's going to be more of the same. It's same kind of thing. Lots of little satirical pieces, articles that I've written for various publications and blog posts and that kind of thing. And I think Giles is putting in a few things of his own. So
Yeah, it's called How Brands Blow. And I've had Byron Sharp's blessing on that. So
I was going to ask because I did see that actually. I couldn't remember the title, and I was like, oh, are people going to think you're having a pop at Byron? But like this conversation clearly suggests you wouldn't be.
No. But so funnily enough, someone actually had a go at me on Twitter for it. And then Byron jumped in and said, "Yeah, no, that's fine." Yeah. No, definitely not having a go at him. It'll be in line with his thinking.
Yeah, I guess with that, kind of what are kind of maybe some of the key themes that you want to try to get across in the book?
Look, not very different from Delusions of Brandeur, really. You know, that sticking to the fundamentals of marketing practice, avoiding, you know, some of the charlatans and some of the trends and vicissitudes that, you know, we see in marketing that people sort of latch onto. Those are the kind of the main themes, and that's kind of the whole, generally the purpose of my satirical work is sort of you know, criticizing those things, but from a looking at it from a I don't know what's the word. It's not confronting them head on so much.
Yeah. But when you think about you know, I guess some of that, you know, there's always going to be trends. There's always going to be things that are, you know, new. I mean, yeah, AI, all that kind of stuff. How do you look at it? Like, because I don't get the impression that you're naturally dismissive, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't get that impression from you. Like you're incredibly smart and, you know, well read, well learned, and so do you try to absorb it and then take the view, and then how do you absorb kind of new information?
Look, I would not claim to be an expert on any of the new technologies, for example. I mean, geez, AI terrifies me. You know, not least for the fact that I don't know what it's going to do to our jobs. But that's, I guess what I do have is that longer term perspective. You know, I've been in the industry quite a while. I understand those principles of marketing, you know, those sort of fundamental principles, I suppose. And therefore, what I can do is I can gauge whether something that comes along is likely to be a flash in the pan or not.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of it seems to be. I think I've generally been proven fairly right with most of it. But, you know, I'll get it wrong, I'm sure. I don't know. The future is looking very uncertain at the moment, so we'll see.
Which parts? I mean, when you said that, you know, AI, what it would do for the jobs, do you genuinely think that's a potential threat, or?
Yeah, look, I do think it's a potential threat. I think for two reasons. Firstly, because I think people are very bad at assessing. Most people are very bad at assessing the quality of creative work and, you know, and writing, for example. And I think a lot of the time, for example, you know, Chat GPT will come out with stuff that most people will think, oh yeah, that seems okay. Doesn't seem that different from, you know, most of the stuff that I see. And so that said, I think at this stage, it's nowhere near the quality of really great creative work. But then my other concern is that it's fairly early days and it's going to get better, and it seems to be getting better pretty quickly. And certainly the people that I respect in the industry, I've certainly seen people saying that look, this really is a game changer, and it's going to get better, and it's going to be a concern, and it's going to take a lot of jobs. Which jobs those are, I don't know, but yeah.
And look, I'm kind of in some way similar, trying to keep up with it, you know, understand it, use it. Again, I mentioned my friend who's a copywriter, KV13, and actually one of the things I don't think AI or Chat GPT will do will be, you know, some of his best work has very few words in it. And I actually don't think that's going to be there, right?
Yeah, it's I think I made a comment on LinkedIn that, like, if I was aiming to be a methamphetamine fueled management consultant, then ChatGPT would be ideal. But it doesn't really replace that sort of that short, you know, brilliant short copy yet.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I'm sorry, not to discount. I do agree with, you know, there are definitely people who will see it and go, this is perfectly fine, and, you know, it will do.
It's
but
okay.
And okay is okay, but, you know, you don't want to work with them. So look, you've a great perspective on kind of marketing, and, you know, I love as you cut like your satirical, you know, outputs and Delusions, and looking forward to how brands blow when that comes out. What do you love about marketing?
I mean, I have always been, well, I would like to think I've always been creative. And so it really is that, you know, I still love the creative side of my work. When we're doing, you know, concepts for new campaigns, that's where I really kind of feel as I'm in my element. And I guess persuasion and writing to tap into emotion, all those kinds of things that, you know, copywriting should be about, is what I enjoy. And also probably having that broader perspective on marketing and understanding how it fits into the broader context. So I enjoy all that stuff. You know, sometimes I would like to be doing a bit less of the day-to-day writing that I'm doing at the moment, just because of the nature of sort of some of the work that we're doing. But yeah, if I could just write sort of concepts for ads all day, I'd be happy.
Yeah, it's like I spend a ton of time in spreadsheets, and I don't enjoy that ever.
This is what puts me off freelancing, actually. You know, that whole business side of it, I don't think I'd be very good at that. So I just want to do the work.
Any advice you'd have then for, you know, somebody who is thinking about a career in copywriting? It might be somebody who's, you know, starting out, or somebody similar to you who's kind of thinking, I'm gonna pivot and change this path. From what you've experienced by doing it, any things you would do differently, or advice you'd have for anyone?
I definitely would have read, you know, the sort of the seminal copywriting books earlier. As we mentioned, Drayton Bird's books, you know, Steve Harrison, How to Write Better Copy, you know, those kinds of things, they completely change your perspective on what you're writing. You know, you're sort of flying blind as a copywriter, and I think a lot of copywriters are like that when they start out. You know, they think, and a lot, you know, they're good writers, for example, and so they think therefore that will immediately translate into good copywriting, and that's just not the case. You know, it is a learned discipline, particularly direct response copywriting, I think. I think the sooner that you can get onto those you know, the works by the great copywriters, the better.
You touched on direct response copywriting, and you've mentioned Drayton a few times. Again, phenomenally influential. Again, I worked in nonprofits, and I used to, you know, read his books to try to get to that, you know, direct response and try test things out. Probably not brilliantly at the time. For you, what are some of the key things, from, without giving away the secret sauce, for direct response from a copy perspective, that you think are like fundamentals and non-negotiable?
Well, one of the points that Drayton often makes is that long copy is, you know, outperforms short copy in direct response copywriting consistently. And it really, you know, it seems like a bit of a lost art. Well, certainly from what I see, it's not. There are lots of great direct response copywriters around, but you know, there's sort of been this trend towards everything getting shorter and shorter, and nobody reads anymore and all that sort of stuff. When it's very clear that the conversion happens when the longer the copy is, and whenever you have a look at Drayton's websites, or if he's got an event that he's promoting, you know, the page just keeps on scrolling until you're converted, basically. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a fundamental misunderstanding. Yeah.
And probably, if you're not sure, like, test it. You know, like, if you think long and short is gonna, you know, not the long and short, but long copy versus short copy, like, really, I don't understand. I can't understand that, why people have a strongly held view and then just go, well, no, people won't read the long copy.
Yeah, it's almost like they get offended by what the test result might show. You thought that one of them was going to be, you know, was going to be better than the other. But yeah, and even testing. I mean, as you know, Drayton tests
religiously, and will, you know, he even talks about the difference that one word can make, or just, it's incredible how detailed he gets and how much knowledge he has about what's going to work.
Yeah. And actually, I'm reading Richard Shotton's book, Illusion of Choice at the moment, and there's a whole, the chapter I'm on at the minute talks about some of the calls to action and formats of, again, going back to nonprofits, some nonprofit direct mail, and just the donation responses, and again, surprising what would actually achieve the higher results, you know. So anyway, I just find that stuff fascinating as well.
Yeah, and Richard's fantastic. I mean, Choice Factory is just a classic. And so many of those things that aren't necessarily intuitive, and you just, you know, they're real eye openers about what works and what doesn't. Yeah.
Well, listen, Ryan, we're at time. Thank you so much for your time this evening for you, and really enjoyed chatting to you. I've been following you on Twitter since I got into Adland, so you know, it's been fantastic to follow you, read your book, and today get to chat to you. Really, really appreciate it.
No, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that episode with Ryan Woolman. If you aren't already following him on Twitter, you should. Look for Dr. Draper. And of course, great news is that in the not too distant future, a new book, How Brands Blow, will be coming out. I think a big takeaway for me from this episode was our need to make sure we continue to educate ourselves and learn about marketing. It doesn't always have to be an expensive MBA or conferences even. That can sometimes be prohibitive to us a lot of the time. But reading books, listening to stuff online is a great way to do that. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening to That's What I Call Marketing. If you did enjoy it, please do share the episode, add comments with any feedback. You can get in touch and find all previous episodes on that'swhatIcallmarketing.com. You can follow us on Instagram on That's What I Call Marketing, on Twitter at That's_marketing. And now you can watch our episodes back on YouTube. Yes, you guessed it. That's What I Call Marketing. So for me, Conor Byrne, until the next episode, thanks for listening. And if you've watched, thanks for watching. Take care.